Week 1 was a wild one, but here to get us ready for week 2, Michael Fabiano, SI's senior fantasy analyst. And Fabs, I'm so glad you're here. It would be easy to overreact to 1 week, so this week, even more than ever, I'm really looking forward to your start and sit. So let's begin with the quarterback position, and one quarterback in particular that you're giving another shot despite last week's disappointing effort.
Yeah, and that's Matthew Stafford, who put up a stink bomb against Buffalo in the season opener, but much better matchup this week, Jen. He's got the Falcons. They gave up over 20 fantasy points to Jameis Winston just last week, and in their last 8 games dating back to last year, they've given up an average of nearly 19 fantasy points per game to quarterback. So forgive and forget with Matthew Stafford. Same thing with Derek Carr. He had a bad game last week too. I don't know what it is about the Chargers. He just cannot score fantasy points against that team. But he's got the Cardinals this week at home, and the Cardinals just came off a game where they gave up 5 touchdowns to Patrick Mahomes. I'm not saying Carr's going to give you 5 touchdowns, but I do have him ranked in my top 12 this week at the quarterback position.
And who are you sitting at the quarterback position? I know one guy you had on this list last week, and you were spot on.
And it's tough to give folks like these high-end quarterbacks to sit because the position has become a little bit thin, right? No Dak Prescott, and we've got some guys near the bottom of the list of quarterbacks that aren't producing. And Tua Tagovailoa is one of those guys where we thought maybe he could end up emerging as a regular fantasy starter, and maybe he will. But last week, despite the fact that Tyreek and Jalen Waddle both had good games, Tua finished with a very modest fantasy stat line. Now he's got to play the Ravens on the road, so I would fade Tua. And of course, this is all in one quarterback leagues. And then let's go to Jameis Winston. I get it, okay? He had a good game last week. He's got a revenge game next against the Buccaneers. But the Buccaneers defense is very tough, and they're very tough against quarterbacks as well. They've given up an average of fewer than 16 fantasy points per game to the position over their last 8 games dating back to last year. So unless you're in a 2 QB league, I am sitting Jameis.
It's kind of amazing how few fantasy points Tua ended up with despite his receivers being so good. It's like the opposite of Geno Smith with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, but I digress. Let's move over to the running back position. Got a couple guys here that going into the season, we weren't sure what their role would be, but they're certainly in smash spots this weekend.
And Antonio Gibson was a stardom last week, and he put up a very good stat line. He was the lead back for the Commanders without Brian Robinson. He put up a very solid 20 fantasy points. He had a 38.2% touch share. Now he's got the Lions, Jen, and how many rushing touchdowns did they give up last week? Oh, that's right, 4. So this is a very good spot for Antonio Gibson. And another guy who was on my stardom list last week, A.J. Dillon. A.J. Dillon was great. He led the Packers in carries, in targets, in rushing yards, in catches and receiving yards. Yeah, that A.J. Dillon. Sorry, Aaron Jones fantasy managers, but I would certainly keep Dillon on your starting lineups for sure against the Bears, who were really getting boat raced by Eli Mitchell last week before he went down with an unfortunate knee injury. So A.J. Dillon is now a very solid RB2 and an even better high-end flex.
Speaking of those 4 rushing touchdowns that Detroit surrendered, it kind of makes me wonder if Curtis Samuel is an even better waiver wire pickup because he can be used as the dual threat, and it just might be a sneaky play. So just if you're putting in your waivers, bear that in mind. As far as sitting running backs, we got a guy who had a stinker last week, and you think he'll probably have another stinker this week.
And Cam Akers is a guy that I've been down on for weeks. And I had a little intel on Daryl Henderson starting last week. He's going to start again this week. I don't know what's going on with Cam Akers. And this isn't even about the matchup either. This is just about pure volume. I mean, this guy had 3 touches last week. That's it. And until Sean McVay starts incorporating him more into the offense, I can't play him. I can play Daryl Henderson. And Ezekiel Elliott. Yes, I'm depressed about it, okay? I'm a Cowboys honk. So are you. I'm not saying that Zeke is a must-sit, okay? I'm not saying that. But if you're in DFS or if you have depth at running back, you may want to consider sitting him. He was on my sit list last week. And let's be honest, he looked good. He averaged 5.2 yards per rush, but the Cowboys were getting boat raced and abandoned the run. Now they've got the Bengals. And the Bengals are not a great run defense, but the Cowboys' offensive line is a mess. Cooper Rush is the quarterback, so I don't think the Bengals are going to respect the pass at all. And that makes Ezekiel Elliott, as much as it hurts my heart to say it, a risky fantasy play. Not a must sit. Just beware Zeke this week.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that anymore. Let's
Me
This is
neither.
so depressing for me. I can't. Okay, let's go over to the wide receiver position. The sun god. We think he's going to deliver.
Amon-Ra St. Brown, boy, he picked up last week right where he left off in 2021 as a rookie. He was also a stardom last week, had a monster game, over 20 fantasy points. Now he's got the Commanders. Their defense gave up over 17 fantasy points to Christian Kirk last week, so Amon-Ra is in my top 15 at wide receiver. Speaking of Christian Kirk, another player we told you to start last week, and he had a big game, right? I guess money talks in this situation. He had 12 targets for 117 yards against the Commanders. Now he's got a matchup against the Colts. They gave up over 15 fantasy points to Brandon Cooks last week in the opener. Christian Kirk, as long as he's seeing those targets, Jen, should be at worst a high wide receiver 3 or flex in fantasy leagues.
Moving over to your sit list. A couple of guys here that we were high on coming into the season, or not high, but we thought they would have good opportunity. But week 1, it didn't look so promising.
And let's start off with Darnell Mooney. Now, listen, it was horrible in Chicago. The weather was terrible. It was raining. It was wet. It was windy. So you give most of the guys a pass. This is really more about the matchup against Green Bay, to be quite honest with you. Their defense is going to be very tough against the pass. They're at Lambeau Field. They got smoked last week by the Vikings. They're going to be motivated to put up big numbers. And sorry, fantasy fans, but Darnell Mooney is not even close to being in Justin Jefferson's stratosphere. So Jefferson had a big game against the Packers. I don't think it's going to be the same for Mooney, who barely saw any opportunities last week in that quagmire in Chicago. And I'm also going to fade Rashad Bateman. Now, I get it. Really good game last week, but he only had a couple of catches. He just was lucky that one of them was a long touchdown. The matchup is much more difficult this week against the Miami Dolphins. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers since week 12 of last year. What's more, they've only given up 53 catches to wide receivers in that time and only 1 touchdown, and that's a 7-game stretch. So Bateman is a guy that I would not chase the points on. I would sit him if I have wide receiver depth.
You know who else got lucky with Rashad Bateman last week? Me, because I had his player prop over at SI Sportsbook and he cashed for us. Thank you, Rashad. Thank you. Let's go to the tight end position. This guy on your start list that was here last week, and he delivered.
Yeah, he had a good game, although most of it was in garbage time, right? Late 2-point conversion, late touchdown, and that's Zack Gerch. Now he's got a matchup against the Raiders, who have been very kind to the opposing tight ends. Let's put it that way. They've given up the 8th most fantasy points to the position in their last 8 games dating back to last year. They gave up a touchdown to Gerald Everett last week, so Zack Gerch is in play, and so is Patrick Freiermuth. I told you to start him last week. He had a very good game. And what's great about Freiermuth, Jen, is that his floor is pretty good. He has scored at least 7.2 fantasy points in PPR leagues in each of his last 8 games. He had 12.5 last week. He's got the Patriots this week, and Mitch Trubisky certainly has a rapport with him, so continue to start Pat Freiermuth at what is a very thin position.
Yeah, honestly, a 7.2 floor at the tight end position for a guy that you drafted late, all day, every day. I love it. Okay, now there's a guy on your sit list that had a big week last week. He was on my bench in a lot of leagues, and a lot of people have questions. Should I start Taysom Hill, just looking for that wildcat?
I wouldn't, because I think he got lucky last week if you started him, and I think he got lucky as well. He had 15 fantasy points, which is great, okay? He played 15 offensive snaps. He blocked on about half of them. He had a 50-yard run, which is not going to happen in most weeks. He got into the end zone. That's not going to happen in most weeks. So if you're a riverboat gambler and you want to play him, okay, fine. But I'm not playing someone who's getting 15 offensive snaps. The percentages of him scoring fantasy points are not very good. And then I'm also benching Mike Yoseki. I told you to sit him last week. I'm saying sit him again this week. He's just not a part of the offense in Miami, which stinks because he was a top 12 fantasy tight end last year. But in Mike McDaniel's offense, Yoseki is now an afterthought. And Jen, I don't even know if I can talk about Yoseki as a sit him moving forward because he's going to start getting cut in a lot of leagues. Also, by the way, the matchup not great against the Baltimore Ravens. So sit Mike Yoseki and potentially cut him in the very near future.
It's so disappointing about Mike Gesicki because he's such a good receiver. But I want to kind of repeat and put a bow on what you said because it was so good, the nugget that you just gave of advice. You talked about Pat Freiermuth giving you a solid floor with 7.2 points across the past 8 games. That is phenomenal, depending on how you want to play, right? Week-to-week matchup. Then you talked about Taysom Hill being your riverboat gambler mood. has a lot to do with how you like to play, right? You could get the big points from Taysom Hill, and you can swing for the fences. If you see that you have someone that's got a lot of points that you're going up against, I can see you making that move. But a lot of times the way to win is just keep that solid floor, get lots of guys to give you a few points every week. So it's all about how you like to play, but know what you're getting into and what kind of player you are. For more advice over at si.com/fantasy, we'll have it. Start sits for every position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, defense, and yes, even kickers. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button on YouTube to not miss anything from si.com/fantasy.